July 24, 1944, Normandy. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of cordite. Across the hedgerows near St. Lo, German officers scanned the horizon from their command post. Through binoculars, they saw rows of American guns, clumsy silhouettes to their eyes, lined up behind the ridge. They laughed quietly. The Wehrmacht had faced British and Soviet artillery before. Nothing new. Nothing the Reich's veterans couldn't withstand. Then the first whistle tore the silence. A moment later, a dozen more. The ground convulsed as if the earth itself rebelled. Trees disappeared in sheets of fire. Telephone lines snapped. Bunkers folded. Within seconds, every ridge line in front of them was swallowed by flame and pulverized soil. The laughter stopped. The German forward observers shouted into their radios, but the wires were dead. Gun after gun poured out a storm of shells at a pace no one thought possible. It wasn't a barrage, it was precision. Every shell arrived together, as if guided by one invisible hand. In minutes, an entire regiment's position ceased to exist. And that was when the German officers realized American artillery had rewritten the rules of war. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, the United States Army was still a modest force, professional, disciplined, but small and outdated. Its artillery doctrine was rooted in lessons from World War I, slow, deliberate, and dependent on wired communication. By European standards, American gunnery seemed methodical but not terrifying. Germany, with its vast experience from the Blitzkrieg campaigns in Poland and France, viewed the U.S. Army as technically competent yet untested, particularly in the art of massed fire. But while Germany's armies swept across Europe, American engineers and officers were quietly building a revolution. In laboratories and testing grounds across Aberdeen, Watervliet, and Picatinny, a new generation of artillerymen worked to solve the age-old problem of precision and coordination. They wanted more than just bigger guns. They wanted faster fire, instant communication, and mathematical accuracy. The result was the 155mm Man 1 Long Tom. Born from interwar research, this gun was a masterpiece of American engineering, a weapon that combined range, stability, and deadly accuracy. It could fire a 95-pound shell over 14 miles, using a split-trail carriage that allowed faster aiming and rapid repositioning. Unlike most German heavy guns that required multiple tractors, the Long Tom was mobile. It could follow advancing forces and bring heavy fire to any point on the battlefield within hours. Behind it stood another innovation: organization. American artillery units were no longer bound to single divisions. Under the guidance of visionary commanders like Brigadier General Everett Hughes and Major General Leslie McNair, the U.S. Army developed the concept of the Field Artillery Group, a flexible, centralized fire network capable of directing massed fire from several battalions onto one target. And then came the technological edge that would terrify German officers in 1944, the technique called time on target. It was simple in theory, revolutionary in practice. Every gun, scattered miles apart, calculated the travel time of its shells so that they all arrived on the target at the same second. No warning shots, no gradual ranging, just silence, and then instant destruction. This method demanded exact clocks, perfect communication, and trained fire direction centers, something Germany's fragmented, battery-level systems could rarely achieve. By 1943, as American forces fought in North Africa and Italy, this doctrine matured. Reports from Tunisia told of German units stunned by barrages that seemed to erupt from nowhere. In Italy, artillery saved entire divisions when terrain or weather grounded aircraft. Yet, few in the Wehrmacht truly grasped what was coming. To them, American artillery was still a support arm, not the hammer of the battlefield. That illusion would last until the hedgerows of Normandy. By the summer of 1944, German artillery officers were among the most seasoned in the world. From the Eastern Front to the deserts of Africa, they had perfected the art of rapid fire and flexible support. Their 10.5 cm LFH-18 and 15 cm SFH-18 field howitzers were reliable, accurate, and familiar to every battery commander in the Wehrmacht. In training manuals, these guns were praised as the backbone of the field army. Their crews could fire 6 to 8 rounds per minute, sustain barrages for hours, and coordinate with infantry through efficient forward observation teams. Against the Soviets, this had worked well. Against the British, it had held the line in North Africa. So when the Americans landed in Normandy in June 1944, most German officers saw little reason for alarm. They respected U.S. tanks, admired Allied air power, but laughed at what they called industrial gunnery. Artillery operated by calculation, not instinct. American guns, they believed, lacked the flexibility and aggression of German crews. They thought the Americans relied too much on radios and rigid procedures, things that would collapse in the chaos of real combat. They could not have been more mistaken. After the D-Day landings, the Battle of Normandy became a war of attrition. The bocage country, narrow lanes, dense hedgerows, small fields, neutralized much of the Allies' air and armor advantage. Infantry units advanced yard by yard. Tanks bogged down or were ambushed at close range. For weeks, the front line barely moved. In this claustrophobic landscape, artillery became the deciding weapon. German forces, under Generalfeldmarschall Günther von Kluge and General Fritz Bayerlein's Panzerlehrdivision, fortified every hedgerow and village. The terrain favored the defenders, who could hide anti-tank guns and mortars in the dense vegetation. To break through, the Americans needed overwhelming firepower, the kind that could obliterate entire defensive zones in one stroke. That task fell to the U.S. First Army's artillery. By mid-July, General Omar Bradley had assembled over 1,500 artillery pieces in the Normandy sector. Among them, hundreds of 150 theater M1 guns and M12 self-propelled howitzers. Batteries were connected through precise radio nets and synchronized watches. Meteorological units provided wind, humidity, and pressure data, ensuring every shell landed exactly where intended. The Germans, meanwhile, struggled to resupply ammunition and fuel. Allied air dominance crippled their logistics. Their artillery, once the pride of Europe, was forced into hiding. Moving guns in daylight risked destruction from fighter bombers. Crews dug deep into orchards, barns, and camouflaged pits. But even that could not save them when the American 155s opened fire. Still, German commanders believed their defenses could hold. The terrain was their ally, they thought. The Americans might bombard endlessly, but the hedgerows and stone villages would absorb much of the shock. Then, on July 24, 1944, the Americans prepared to prove them wrong. Operation Cobra. The breakout from Normandy would begin with the most concentrated artillery bombardment ever assembled by U.S. forces. It would involve hundreds of guns, firing thousands of shells in a matter of minutes, followed by a coordinated airstrike. The German officers watching from St. Lo that morning believed they had weathered Allied storms before. But this time, they faced something entirely new. A weapon of precision, coordination, and industrial might that would redefine how war was fought. And it began with the first flash of the Long Tom's barrel. To understand what made the American 155mm artillery so devastating, one must look not just at the weapon, but at the system that made it work. Unlike earlier wars, where gunnery relied on experience and instinct, the U.S. Army treated artillery as an exact science, a marriage of engineering, mathematics, and discipline. Every American gun crew in Normandy operated as part of a wider machine. At the top stood the Fire Direction Center, FDC, the unseen brain of each battalion. Inside, soldiers hunched over plotting boards, calculating azimuths, wind drift, and flight times. Using slide rules and firing tables, they converted map coordinates into precise elevation angles. When the command came, their calculations synchronized the fire of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of guns. This was no guesswork. Every gun position was pre-surveyed, every target fixed to a grid, every watch synchronized to the second. That meant an artillery commander could order time on target, 600 hours, and every battery, spread miles apart, would adjust its timing so that shells from different directions arrived simultaneously on the objective. To the Germans, accustomed to sequential ranging fire, this was unthinkable. They expected a few ranging shots first, the telltale warning before the storm. But with the American system, there was no warning, only sudden annihilation. Radio networks tied the entire system together. American field units used the SCR-610 and SCR-284 radios to maintain near-instant communication. Forward observers in jeeps, half-tracks, and even Piper Cub aircraft called in coordinates from the front lines. They could adjust fire in seconds, not minutes. And behind it all, U.S. logistics kept the guns alive. Each 150 mm long tom required a steady stream of ammunition, shells that weighed nearly 100 pounds apiece. Yet, thanks to the Red Ball Express and the tireless work of quartermasters, supply lines fed the guns continuously. German intelligence reports would later marvel that American artillery never runs dry. Precision, speed, coordination. The Bayeux long tom was merely the visible expression of something deeper, a philosophy of warfare rooted in calculation and control. To the Americans, artillery was not a weapon of chance. It was a mathematical guarantee, and when unleashed, that guarantee could erase entire battalions in minutes. But behind those equations were men, sweating, deafened, and exhausted, turning precision into destruction by sheer will. For the American gun crews, the long tom was more than a machine. It was a living, breathing force that demanded strength, rhythm, and trust. Each shot was a symphony of muscle and timing. A gun section was a family of 9 or 10 men. They worked in silence except for shouted commands. Load! Fire! Shift left 2 degrees! Sweat mixed with powder soot. The air trembled with recoil, and the metallic scream of the breech echoed in their ears. They learned to sense the gun's rhythm, when to duck, when to lift, when to brace. The shock wave from every blast hit like a punch to the chest. Dust clung to their faces. Eardrums throbbed for hours. But they didn't stop. The average 155 mm crew could fire 2 to 3 rounds per minute for hours on end, their arms aching as the gun trail bit into the soil. To them, this was duty, methodical, relentless. They didn't see their targets, only coordinates, only the next mission. But they knew the impact. Word spread through the ranks about what their barrages did to enemy positions. The gunners took pride in their precision. "We hit what we aim at," one crewman wrote home, "and when we hit, nothing stands." On the other side, German soldiers learned to dread the sound that preceded annihilation. A faint, distant whine that seemed to grow from the air itself. Then, everything disappeared. Veterans of the Panzer Lehr Division described the Long Tom barrages as unlike anything they had faced, even on the Eastern Front. One report recorded that the air became fire, the ground moved like water. Men clung to the earth as trenches caved in and tree trunks shattered like matchsticks. There was no pattern, no pause, no warning. The shells landed with unnatural precision. Entire command posts vanished before they could send a single order. The The sound of screaming mixed with the deafening thunder of detonations. Many survivors described the sensation of suffocation, not from smoke, but from fear. One German lieutenant later wrote in his diary, "It was not artillery. It was the end of the world. We could not even lift our heads. The Americans had measured us, and we were erased." This was the psychological weapon the Americans never advertised but always understood. Artillery was not only destruction, it was domination. It shattered morale before it shattered ground. And by the time the smoke lifted, even hardened German veterans had learned a truth that would echo through the rest of the war. The United States had mastered industrialized precision, warfare. But the full extent of that mastery would only be revealed in one moment when the guns of Operation Cobra roared to life. Dawn broke over Normandy on July 25, 1944, under a pale, smoky sky. The hedgerows were still damp from the night mist, and the faint rumble of engines echoed from behind the American lines. For days, Allied troops had been preparing for what they called Cobra, the plan to shatter the German front west of St. Lo and open the road into Brittany and beyond. The Americans had learned from the slow, grinding weeks that followed D-Day. The bocage country had eaten men and machines alike. Every field was a fortress, every hedge concealing an ambush. The only way forward now was to break the wall completely, not inch through it. At 0900 hours, the signal came. From behind the tree lines and ruined farms, more than 2,500 American artillery pieces opened fire almost simultaneously. The earth shuddered beneath them. 105mm howitzers, 155mm long toms, and 8-inch guns, all firing in synchronized waves. Each gun had its target, each battery its moment. Fire direction centers had spent days calculating the perfect grid overlaps, ensuring that every shell struck within a narrow corridor. Forward observers had marked German strongpoints, suspected gun pits, and communication hubs. Now, the fire descended upon them with machine-like precision. To the Germans in the line, it came as a single thunderous explosion that did not end. Shells fell with terrifying consistency. One every few seconds, from every direction. Fields vanished under geysers of smoke and earth. Tanks were flipped, half-tracks overturned, and bunkers crushed like paper. Inside Panzer Lehr Division's positions, chaos erupted. General Fritz Bayerlein, a seasoned commander who had survived North Africa, tried to coordinate a response. But every communication line was cut. Runners sent through the fields never returned. Observation posts disappeared. The artillery was everywhere, he later recalled. It was not a barrage. It was a wall. For nearly 45 minutes, the American guns roared without pause. Infantrymen miles away could feel the ground trembling under their boots. Pilots in the sky saw a rolling gray cloud stretching for miles, a moving storm of steel and dust. And when the guns finally ceased, the silence that followed was almost worse. German soldiers stumbled out of shattered trenches, dazed and bleeding. Their world was gone. Maps useless. Officers missing. Morale destroyed. They didn't know it yet. But the American tanks were already rolling forward. When the last echo of the guns faded, the battlefield fell into a stunned, unnatural quiet. The air shimmered with heat. Smoke clung to the ground like a living fog, hiding the ruin that stretched for miles. Trees stood blackened, stripped of leaves, their trunks splintered by shock waves. The hedgerows that had once favored the defenders were gone, flattened into scars of scorched earth. Then came the next phase. The silence broke with the growl of engines. From the fields behind the lines, columns of Sherman tanks and M10 tank destroyers surged forward. Infantrymen of the U.S. 30th and 9th Divisions followed close behind, stepping through craters still hot from the bombardment. There was almost no resistance. German survivors, men from the Panzer Division, 2nd SS Panzer Corps, and 352nd Infantry Division, were no longer a cohesive force. Their command structure had been pulverized. Radios were dead, ammunition dumps destroyed, and artillery batteries silenced. Many soldiers were found wandering, ears bleeding, unable to speak. Those who could fight did so blindly. Machine guns opened sporadically from ruined farmhouses, only to be silenced within minutes by American counterfire. Others surrendered in shock. One captured German sergeant told his interrogators, "We thought you had brought every gun in the world." In a sense, they had. The U.S. Army's doctrine of massed artillery, perfected over years of testing and training, had reached its ultimate expression. Over 25,000 rounds had been fired in less than an hour, guided by forward observers and coordinated by exact timing. Every American division in the sector contributed its share. By the afternoon of July 25th, the American spearheads were through. The German front west of St. Lo had collapsed, opening a breach nearly 6 miles wide. Armored columns poured through the gap, driving deep into the countryside toward Coutances and Avranches. General Omar Bradley later wrote, "Our artillery made Cobra possible. The infantry advanced through dust, not defenses. For the Germans, it was a catastrophe unlike anything they had faced in France. The battle lines that had held for 7 weeks disintegrated in a single day. Even veterans of the Eastern Front admitted they had never seen such coordinated destruction." The thunder of the long toms had not only shattered the ground, it had shattered the myth of German invincibility. And, as the U.S. Army rolled forward into open country, the true power of American industry, technology, and organization stood revealed for the first time. By the evening of July 25, 1944, the battlefield west of St. Lo had transformed from a fortress into a wasteland. The hedgerows that once trapped Allied forces had vanished under the weight of steel and fire. What began as a meticulously planned artillery operation ended as one of the most decisive moments of the entire Normandy campaign. German reports describe the scene with disbelief. In his post-war testimony, General Fritz Bayerlein admitted that communications ceased entirely. The artillery fire was beyond anything we had experienced on the Eastern Front. He estimated that half his division's vehicles were destroyed before the first American infantrymen appeared. A captured German officer from the 352nd Infantry Division reported that entire battalions had ceased to exist. Trenches were unrecognizable. Unit boundaries dissolved into chaos. The Americans moved forward with almost mechanical efficiency. Engineers cleared debris. Medics followed closely behind. Artillery units leapfrogged ahead, re-establishing firing positions to maintain pressure on retreating German forces. It was an operation built on precision. Every man knowing his role, every gun ready to fire again if needed. On the ground, soldiers could still feel the tremor of the guns in their bones. Survivors of the Panzer Lehr called the aftermath a moonscape. Tanks lay overturned in craters. Horses and vehicles were twisted together in grotesque wreckage. But amid the devastation, the sense of momentum was undeniable. For the first time since D-Day, the American Army was no longer confined to the bocage. The way to open terrain, and eventually Paris, had been cleared. Artillery commanders reviewed the results that evening. Their calculations had proven perfect. Targets had been destroyed within tolerances of mere yards. The synchronization of time on target had exceeded expectations. One report from the First Army noted proudly, "Enemy resistance collapsed before infantry engagement. Objective achieved through fire superiority." And from that day onward, the Germans never underestimated American artillery again. Their soldiers began to refer to it bitterly as the invisible front, a weapon that struck without warning, without mercy, and without error. The success of Operation Cobra was more than a battlefield victory. It was the breaking point of German resistance in France, Within days of the St. Lo barrage, the U.S. First Army had advanced over 20 miles through what was once thought impassable country. By August 1st, the newly activated U.S. Third Army, under General George S. Patton, was unleashed into open ground. What followed was the fastest Allied advance since the war began. The artillery's role in that transformation was absolute. Patton himself would later write, "Our guns paved every road we took. Wherever tanks met resistance, artillery cleared the way. Whenever German counterattacks gathered, they were annihilated before they began." The American Army had discovered that it could destroy not just defenses, but the will to resist. German commanders recognized it too. Intercepted communications from General Feldmarschall Günther von Kluge's headquarters reveal a tone of despair. "We are being attacked by mathematics, not men." Another field report described the American method as precise beyond reason, every gun firing as one mind. The psychological effect spread quickly. German soldiers began to dig deeper, move less, and fire sparingly, fearing retaliation that would arrive with uncanny speed. Many units abandoned positions overnight rather than risk detection. The once feared Wehrmacht artillery, battered and undersupplied, could no longer match the tempo. By mid-August, the Allied armies had encircled tens of thousands of German troops in the Falaise pocket, sealing the fate of the Normandy campaign. What began with the roar of 150mm guns at St. Lo ended with the destruction of Germany's last hope of holding France. American artillery had proven not only superior in technology, but in philosophy, a weapon system born from planning, precision, and relentless coordination. From that point onward, every German commander who faced the U.S. Army knew that any mistake, any exposure, would be answered by the thunder of guns they could neither match nor escape. The battlefield had spoken, and it spoke in the language of the Long Tom. When the guns finally fell silent over Normandy, the fields of St. Lo lay buried beneath a gray mist of dust and smoke. The villages were gone, the hedgerows shattered, the earth itself scarred and reshaped. For the men who fought there, it was hard to tell where the land ended and war began. But in those ruins, something profound had changed. The U.S. Army had entered Normandy still learning the lessons of modern warfare. Its infantry was brave, its tanks determined. But it was the artillery that became its soul. The 155mm Long Tom and its smaller brother, the 105mm howitzer, turned coordination into an art form. Each shell was no longer just an explosive. It was a calculation, the sum of wind, angle, temperature, and time. In that sense, American artillery became the first truly mathematical weapon of World War II. Not merely about firepower, but about precision. The synchronization of hundreds of guns, directed by radio, radar, and the cold logic of computation. It was war as science, stripped of guesswork and pride. And yet, behind that precision stood people. Young gunners in muddy fields, hunched over sighting instruments and plotting boards. Forward observers crawling through hedgerows with radios strapped to their backs. Commanders balancing equations with human lives. Every perfect impact came at the cost of sweat, fear, and sometimes silence, because the sound that followed each barrage was not triumph, but absence. The German officers who once mocked American guns had seen this transformation firsthand. They had underestimated not the weapon, but the system behind it, an army that could turn logistics, communication, and discipline into destruction. From St. Lo to the Rhine, the thunder of those guns would follow. Each barrage carried the echo of that moment, when the world's most advanced army discovered how to turn data into dominance. In the end, the story of American artillery in Normandy is not one of vengeance or glory. It is the story of how war evolved, from courage to calculation, from instinct to intelligence, and how, beneath the smoke and ruin, The future of modern warfare was written in the bright arcs of shells that once leveled the defenses of St. Lo in minutes.